Hello there. Welcome to another installment of the Brains versus Stomachs project. On our research channel here, we talk about how demography affects macroeconomic growth and productivity. In this episode, we will be doing a critical review of the demographic dividend hypothesis, covering what it gets right, what it gets wrong, why it doesn't really work, and why there are alternative hypotheses you should probably pay more attention to, but more importantly, how to fix the demographic dividend hypothesis and get it working. Part 1, introducing the demographic dividend hypothesis. So we'll go through this with a quick recap. So the demographic dividends basically posits that changes in age structure, that is primarily through the demographic transition, may uplift economic growth, right? Emphasis on the terminology there. They may uplift economic growth. The dividend hypothesis adds a conditionality constraint, stating that this expansionary effect on macroeconomic growth and productivity depends on the right policies to harness the dividend, right? In effect, it's saying there's no guarantee and that economies can miss this dividend. The dividend hypothesis also expresses that this upliftment is time-bound, right? That the dividend must be harnessed in a window of opportunity, and that effectively there is some level of exogeneity, right? More adults per capita, as per the dividend hypothesis, guarantees nothing economically because you need to get the right jobs, you need to have conducive business, etc. And so it places the constraint, the condition rather, that certain factors, exogenous in nature, need to occur before this demographic transition, a change in age structure, can have an effect on the economy. And hence it adds an exogeneity constraint of sorts. So that's the dividend hypothesis in summary. Part 2, what the dividend hypothesis gets wrong, the error, and that is the assumption of exogeneity. So for those familiar with our channel, as we covered in one of our prior videos, we talk about the macroeconomic exogeneity error, which the dividend hypothesis commits. We'll just recap on what this error is. Starting with the production function here, we've used a solo swan model with human capital. So output is a function of physical capital, human capital, technology, labor, and our various output elasticities. Most macro neoclassical models assume that physical capital, human capital, and technology are exogenous to labor, and in reality, they are not. Physical capital requires labor hours allocated to the production of physical capital, so engineers, plumbers, welders, and the like here. Human capital also requires labor hours dedicated to increasing human capital, educators, lecturers, teachers, librarians, principals, parents, etc. Technology requires human labor allocated to technology production, so innovators, scientists, inventors, designers, and so on. And so effectively, labor is the primordial factor of production. By assuming that KHA are exogenous to L, one is effectively committing an exogeneity error. Now, of course, it's alluring to make this assumption of exogeneity. Of course, that way you preserve your Gauss-Markov theorem, and hence your linear regression becomes blue, and it obviously eases the task of statistical inference. However, it's not correct. Labor is the primordial factor of production. Human capital, physical capital, and technology cannot grow in the absence of labor. So this exogeneity error is not really an error in a strict sense. It's not as if we're saying the solo swan model is wrong. That is not the argument we're making here, but rather that if you are going to use a macroeconomic model to estimate the effect of labor on output, you should not be using a model that assumes that various factors such as capital and technology are exogenous to labor. So exogeneity is you know, it depends on the model. In an ISLM model, for example, one assumes that you know, money supply growth is exogenous and interest rates are endogenous. That is an acceptable model from the perspective of, say, a central banker, and so it doesn't mean the ISLM model is wrong. But for purposes of demographic inquiry, like we're doing here, this is an error, and it does lead to rather flawed results. And so effectively what's happening, because of this exogeneity error, the dividend hypothesis undermines itself. It states that the dividend isn't guaranteed, yet the truth is it is, because the more labor per capita a nation or an economy can harness, hence the more output per capita across the various macroeconomic sectors. So, for example, one might hear the refrain that getting more adults per capita guarantees nothing because one needs to add jobs. Well, where do jobs come from? They come from adults. So the more adults per capita you get, the more job creation ability you get. Everything you need to supposedly harness this dividend comes with the demographic transition. And so because the dividends are guaranteed, the dividend hypothesis ends up being a lot more powerful than the initial authors and current users actually realize. In effect, an older and more gender-equal economy is more productive and will grow faster, ceteris paribus. To further investigate this argument, we would refer you to our prior video entitled Demographic Endogenous Growth Theory. But in effect, this is the mistake that the dividend hypothesis makes. It's a rather technical error. It effectively uses an exogenous model instead of using what should be an endogenous model to capture the fact that labor is the primordial factor of production. Part 3, weaknesses of the dividend hypothesis. What the dividend hypothesis fundamentally gets wrong. So because of this exogeneity error, we get quite a few problematic prognostications, if you will. The first one is a matter of science. The dividend hypothesis at its core is not aligned with the established science on human physiology. The dividend hypothesis posits effectively that getting more adults per capita has no guaranteed expansionary effect on economic productivity. Hence, the dividend hypothesis is stating that adults are not naturally more productive than children and teenagers. This is not true. Rather, indeed, adults are more productive than teenagers and children and elderly. It has nothing to do with harnessing the dividend or getting policies right. This is just a facet of basic human physiology. And frankly, the claim that a group of human beings or economic agents, if you will, can transition from being toddlers to being adults and exhibit no productivity improvement whatsoever is beyond implausible and delves into the realms of science fiction, really. So that's the first sin of the dividend hypothesis. The second problem is that it's not backed by any evidence. We do not have any scenario of a nation or an economy achieving a demographic transition. That is a stage 1 to stage 4 population pyramid transition while exhibiting no economic growth or productivity. That has never happened. We also don't have any instances of a nation or an economy not going through a transition while achieving a fairly robust level of macroeconomic growth. You can't grow without the demographic transition. That's what the data suggests. The data also suggests growth without a demographic transition is nigh impossible. The third problem is alarmism. Effectively, the dividend hypothesis promulgates an alarmist narrative, specifically targeted towards developing countries, that if they achieve a demographic transition, nothing is guaranteed. They might stay poor as they were before. Again, this has never happened. We don't have any tangible empirical evidence of this happening now. And so it perpetuates this kind of alarmism. And just to go back in time, it started off with alarmism around high fertility and the misguided belief that poor countries might grow beyond their ability to sustain themselves, right? The Malthusian alarmism of the 80s and 70s as spearheaded by the works of Paul Ehrlich. And now with fertility declining, a new alarmist narrative is being synthesized by the dividend hypothesis, claiming that the demographic transition guarantees nothing in terms of economic growth. So again, a rather problematic alarmist narrative that is being perpetuated. Finally, I suppose the greatest problem with the dividend hypothesis is that it effectively makes for bad policy, because it now obstructs the demographic transition as the rightful economic channel, right? It effectively says gender equality, inclusivity, and healthcare have no guaranteed effect on economic growth and productivity, right? Because you might miss the dividend. So that is obviously not productive. It makes it much harder, therefore, for developing countries to rightfully prioritize the demographic transition for economic growth. Indeed, when a finance minister in a developing country tried to convince them rather that they should pursue, gender equality, inclusivity, and healthcare, and you will be assailed by a cacophony of sort of refrain that one might miss the dividend and nothing is guaranteed, and hence nations end up deprioritizing gender equality, inclusivity, and healthcare, which are the main socioeconomic instruments of achieving a demographic transition. So just to hammer the point home through an illustration using the data of why the dividend hypothesis doesn't work, and just to give you further details of the problems with the current hypothesis. So first and foremost, as we mentioned, is the presence of alarmism. The dividend hypothesis is effectively saying it's possible for nations to go through a transition and end up with no growth whatsoever. Again, this has never happened. We don't have any evidence of this. And frankly, it takes on a rather alarmist perspective, because of course what the dividend hypothesis is effectively saying is that when developing countries, which are mostly from the global south, mostly from Africa and a few countries in the Middle East and South Asia, when they go through the transition, they might stay poor. Yet when nations above the equator, when nations in the global north go through the transition, they got rich. So it's a rather reckless narrative, as it takes on one might say, a certain ethnic angle. Of course, that is not the intention of the authors, I'm sure, but nonetheless, that is an interpretation that one can arrive to. The other variant of this missing dividend alarmism is the idea that poor countries might get old before they get rich. Again, the data says otherwise. As you can see here, every nation that has achieved demographic transition, we're talking roughly median age of 40 to 45, is broadly within the high income band. We don't have any credible evidence that nations can fall below this line. Rather, getting old before you get rich would look something like this, right? Again, we don't have any evidence of this. We have some outliers, but no credible evidence, and we don't have any credible sort of forward-looking empirical models that substantiate this thesis. Another problem that emerges with the dividend hypothesis is the presence of what we're calling here red herring policies, right? The suggestion that because the demographic transition guarantees nothing economically, that nations can therefore develop in the absence of a transition. And again, you can see from the data here, that is that is a spurious result. You do get some outliers for sure, but generally speaking, meaningful economic development in the absence of a demographic transition is not possible. When nations stay young, nations stay poor. And the dividend hypothesis, unfortunately, opens up this sort of line of thinking that, perhaps through institutions or free markets, whatever have you, and nations might get rich. But again, that's not what the data suggests. The data suggests very clearly that nations go through a transition, then they get rich. And again, just to highlight once again the main sort of the capital crime of the dividend hypothesis, which is that it ends up obscuring the rightful economic policy prescription, which is, again, an accelerated demographic transition through gender equality, inclusivity, and healthcare. Gender equality lowers our fertility rate, expands the labor force participation of women, a very powerful effect that we hope to talk more about on this channel, the very, very potent effect of educating young girls and ensuring that women are given, have reproductive rights and are given the same rights and opportunities occupationally and in terms of education. Inclusivity as well, another expansionary effect, right? The need to include, to make sure that as many of your adults in the population are engaged in meaningful labor. And of course, healthcare, which increases, which expands the population of adults per capita. So, part 4, strengths of the dividend hypothesis. We've offered a rather critical analysis here, or a rather critical perspective of the dividend hypothesis. Nonetheless, the dividend hypothesis gets a range of things correct, and in this part we will talk through what it gets right. So, first and foremost, the dividend hypothesis is mostly correct, right? It is mechanically flawless. Remember that the main error the dividend hypothesis is making is that it is using the wrong empirical model. It is using an exogenous solo model, whereas it should be using an endogenous model. And so everything else in the dividend hypothesis checks out. The first dividend, the second dividend, etc. These mechanisms are correct. They are guaranteed. They do indeed have a direct expansionary causal effect, on economic growth and productivity. So that's good. The second strength of the dividend hypothesis is its intellectual density. This is a very well-cited body of work, and hence it's very well reviewed. A lot of critiques, a lot of modifications, variations. That allows one, it leads to the third advantage, which is that it's flexible. This is a model that can be reinterpreted. It can be modified, it can be adjusted, it can be corrected. And the main method, of course, is through endogenization, right? The recognition of labor as the primordial factor of production for all the macro sectors in your production function. Overall, the dividend hypothesis finally has a good problem, right? This is a good problem to have if your model isn't working. A model that is more powerful, like we mentioned. The dividend hypothesis is effectively more powerful and more accurate than the initial authors and many scholars realize, because again, the first and second dividends are guaranteed. So it's a good problem to have, right? 99% of the dividend hypothesis is correct. It makes one very minor and rather technical error in the use of an exogenous model versus an endogenous model. And overall, a good problem to have, one that can be fixed, one that can be, through modification, we can get a better model. So, part 5, the way forward. How can we perfect the dividend hypothesis and other options? So we'll start with what we call the perfection of the dividend hypothesis at a quantitative level. Because it's a modeling error, it's rather the use of a wrong model, the natural solution is to use an endogenous model. So in that regard, one does have a range of options available to them. There you have the Arrow-Lucas model, that is the AK model, old but gold. The Romer model is also quite interesting, and the Jones variant for those more inclined towards technology as the primary, if you're interested in that as the primary growth driver. Another option is the Lucas-Uzawa model, and that, of course, is very similar to the Solow model. It's, the Lucas-Uzawa at its core is effectively an endogenized Solow-Swan model. We mentioned the Neustr variant here because that adds natural resources as another factor of production, which maps well with the core factors of production, but it also gives the model a more intuitive sort of framework in terms of understanding macroeconomics and how demography affects the macroeconomy. Certainly if you're one who comes from a more demographic or geographic background, the Neustr variant is very useful. We also have Schumpeterian models, obviously, for those inclined towards a more qualitative analysis that would be consistent and would yield better results. One may also want to look at an endogenized Solow-Swan model with human capital. This is the approach that we have taken. And you can find that video in our channel. So, we'll put a link here. Check that out if you want to see how the dividend hypothesis works using a Solow-Swan model, an endogenized Solow-Swan model, rather. And finally, one may also use an endogenized Ramsey-Cass-Couplan's model. What makes an endogenized RCK model interesting is that your model will be able to give you the age structure of production as well as the age structure of consumption, and you can get some very interesting insights from that analysis. Broadly also maps well with the work of Paul Samuelson. His demographic equations also touch on that aspect. So some very interesting insights you can get from an endogenized RCK model. And of course, number 2, depending on your approach, you will obviously want to fix the endogeneity issues. So, instrumental variables and the like, your general methods, moments, etc., etc. That again, depending on your approach, you may want to address the endogeneity issue. Now, finally, in terms of quantitative perfection, you would want to basically synthesize this chart here. So the black line we take from the work of Bloom and Canning, and I think this is from the Bloom and Williamson paper, although it may have come up earlier. Effectively, share of the total population on your y-axis, and on your x-axis, you have the demographic stage or time, and effectively, early demographic transition imposes a contractionary effect as the young cohort enter into their teenage years, and hence you have fewer adults per capita. But then once you're into stage 2 to stage 4, you get more adults per capita before you finally moderate at a stage 5 or 6, depending on your approach, interpretation. But effectively, what you want to synthesize are these variables here, right? You want to show that in the early phases of the demographic transition, you have a large ratio of subsistence farmers or non-workers per capita, as well as reproduction workers per capita, right? This is the Malthusian epoch of sorts, right? Prior to the demographic transition, a preponderance of the adult population is allocated to subsistence farming and having lots of children. And then a demographic transition unfolds, and subsistence farmers decline as a share of the total adult population. as well as reproduction workers as fertility rates moderate. And so you want to show that effect. And of course, the green line here is specialized workers per capita. That's the juice, right? That's what unlocks the second dividend. That's what unlocks true economic growth. Effectively, prior to the demographic transition, you have too few specialized workers per capita. Post-demographic transition, you now have more specialized workers per capita. So with these modifications, one can get the dividend hypothesis to start working and to start giving us credible results. At a more qualitative level, the following adjustments would also be highly recommended. Instead of the nomenclature of the dividend hypothesis may, right, nations may harness the dividend, you want to say nations will harness the dividend. Again, basic human physiology, the more adults per capita, ceteris paribus, we should expect an upliftment in economic productivity. It's also consistent with the empirical evidence. There is no such thing as nations missing the dividend, right? This is a purely theoretical outcome, so one should avoid the conditionality. And once again, you want to avoid the alarmism of nations missing the dividend, and instead you should say the dividend is guaranteed, because it is. Thirdly, one also wants to avoid the implication that economies can develop in the absence of a demographic transition. In reality, as we showed you earlier, development is severely constrained in the absence of a demographic transition. With all three phases here, it's important to note that the timing and magnitude of this dividend depends on policies on health, gender, and inclusivity, right? It is not at all the case that once one goes through the demographic transition, that they will experience the same level of growth and productivity. Nope. That is where the policy kicks in, but all policy does is it alters the timing and the magnitude of the effect. But the effect is not dependent on policy entirely. It will still happen, regardless of a nation's political system, their ethnicity, their nationality, their geography, their political system, their economic system. The more adults per capita, the more that nation will produce, right? Because it's more workers per capita. And it's important to point out this deterministic effect because, like we said, it's baked into human physiology, right? The agency required for economic agents to produce goods and services comes from the economic agents themselves. Finally, another sort of adjustment one might want to make is that instead of using these more nebulous terms of dividends and windows of opportunity and harnessing, etc., it might instead be preferable to just use the quantitative measures, which broadly are, essentially aggregate specialized labor hours per capita per unit of time, right? And so when you're doing comparative macroeconomic analysis and you're comparing a nation with the median age of 18 with another nation with a median age of 35, one must adjust for differences in workers per capita, right? It makes no sense to look at one population that, say, has 2 workers for every 10 people and then compare them to another nation that has 6 workers for every 10 people and start telling the country with that 2 workers that they might miss the dividend and windows of opportunity, harnessing, and all that stuff. It's far better to actually just measure the effect and talk about productivity adjusted for differences in aggregate labor hours per capita per unit of time. And if you'd like to see what that looks like, well, stay tuned. We'll hopefully cover that through in other episodes on the channel, so stay tuned for that. So effectively, this is how you perfect the dividend hypothesis, right, at a quantitative and qualitative level. Like we said, it's not a bad hypothesis. It works, it's just that it has a significant flaw, but this is how you get it to give you good results. Finally, there are simply better models out there. So, starting with unified growth theory by Dr. Oded Galor, and I think he was also assisted by David Weil. Unified growth theory correctly posits that before nations can develop, they first need to go through a demographic transition. UGT broadly defines that as the adult population growing faster than the childhood population, which again maps to the quantitative measures of getting more adults per capita. And so UGT gets it right, and you can find many models out there that prove UGT at an empirical level. I would highly recommend the paper by a Dr. Michael Cervellati, I believe, from Italy, who substantiated UGT. Remember, the dividend hypothesis tells us virtually nothing about, demographic transitions. So if you have a population going from a stage 1 pyramid to a stage 5 population pyramid, according to the dividend hypothesis, nothing is guaranteed, right? But according to UGT, that right there is a growth stimulus, and UGT gets it right. So please check out UGT, and we hope to do some content highlighting why UGT works so well in terms of demographic, the demographic effect on the economy. Also worth mentioning, UGT talks about other facets of economic development, such as behavioral economics and the like, things that are well outside our skill set here on the BVS project, so we won't go into that. Our interest in UGT is solely restricted to the effect of the demographic transition on economic growth and productivity. Secondly, one might want to look at the demographic U hypothesis coming from South Korean scholars Dr. Chong-Boom An and Dr. Sun-Hoon Jun. I hope I pronounced those correctly. What makes this model interesting is that it factors in healthcare metrics, specifically life expectancy. That's always good to see economists rightfully using healthcare vitality statistics to directly map them to macroeconomic growth and productivity. So check that out, very interesting model. Another interesting approach that gets it right is intergenerationality. This is the work by Dr. Ronald Lee and Dr. Andrew Mason, what we call the Lee-Mason model. Now, the Lee-Mason model is interesting because what they do is they map the productivity of an economic agent across age, right? And so they identify that sort of, that if I can just illustrate it effectively, what the Lee-Mason model gets right is that, you've got your population, something like that. Sorry, productivity as a function of age looks something like that. And then they map the population pyramid, noting that you start off with a population pyramid that looks something like that. And then through a demographic transition, it moves to something like that. So very interesting. It gives you a far more granular measure of how demography impacts the macroeconomy. And they, of course, are running their own project called the National Transfer Account. Certainly a far more robust project than our own humble effort here. So please check that out. That's the NTA project, the National Transfer Accounts. Please check that out. They have mapped these curves for a range of countries across many years, and it gives you, like I said, very, very accurate model for how to estimate the effect of the demographic transition on economic growth and productivity. Fourth is not so much a model as it is a case study, and that is the excellent work done by USAID. So USAID got this right at some point earlier in their, years back, I believe in the 90s, thereabouts, 80s. USAID correctly identified that the best way to help poor countries is through an accelerated demographic transition, and hence why USAID focused on gender equality, inclusivity, and healthcare. And USAID has done wonderful work across many developing countries, proof positive that, they got it right. Unfortunately, obviously as of making this video, USAID is no more, most unfortunate, but they have done excellent work, and I hope through our own efforts here, we can do some videos, case studies highlighting the excellent work that they have done in accelerating the demographic transition and improving the economic growth prospects of many developing countries. I suppose the challenge with the work of USAID is, given that, it's demography and it takes time, is that the work of USAID, the expansionary effect from the work that they did is something that you will not notice in a short time period, right? It takes sometimes decades for a nation to, especially in the early stages, for an economy to go from a stage 1 to a stage 2 or stage 3 population pyramid, right? That takes time. In fact, moving from a stage 2 population pyramid to a stage 5 population pyramid happens fairly swiftly, but from stage 1 to stage 2, that takes time, and that is where USAID has really been doing good work. But of course, it's not just USAID. We wish to highlight the excellent work done by a range of philanthropists, such as the Bill Gates Foundation, specifically the Melinda Gates and her focus on gender equality. We hope to cover that. Shout out to all the gender and feminist activists and advocates that have been getting it right, and it is most unfortunate that thanks to the dividend hypothesis, their efforts and their advocacy unfortunately has been compromised. The truth is, any sort of development effort to accelerate gender equality and women's emancipation has a profoundly powerful expansionary effect on the economy. So check out the work of USAID and check out the works of philanthropists such as, as we've mentioned here, Bill and Melinda Gates. Finally, a simpler model that also works better than the dividend hypothesis is simply take the nuts and bolts of the dividend hypothesis. You don't need to change much, and simply use the correct endogenous neoclassical model, right? So as we said earlier, you've got many options available to you, right? You've got your Lucas Ozawas and what have you. So, a range of options available. Just map the dividend hypothesis onto an endogenous model and, Bob's your uncle. In conclusion, it's all about demographic endogenization. The dividend hypothesis is not wrong, right? It's great, but it does have a very serious flaw in that it uses the wrong statistical model, and it uses the wrong assumptions emanating from that statistical model. And a very easy, well, perhaps not easy, but an accessible solution is available to you. Simply endogenize. So, as per our cringe meme here, the takeaway, what we hope you take away from this video isn't really, we're not here to critique the dividend hypothesis too much or to throw cold water on the excellent work done by Doctors Bloom, Canning, and Sevilla. They got it right. We're just pointing out a minor or a small but very serious flaw. But at the end of the day, they got it right. And I suspect if one was to sit down with the initial authors, they themselves will tell you that they believe that the demographic transition does indeed have a more powerful effect on the economy than people realize. So what we hope you take away from this video is that there are better methods for estimating the effect of the demographic transition on the economy, and the key is to endogenize. Thank you, and that's the end of the video. If you found this useful, again, we're here to inspire, here to help you as a scholar, as an intellectual, as a writer, as someone with perhaps a more technical understanding of these issues. We're just hoping to inspire you. So please, if you found this useful, if you found this meaningful, please consider supporting our project. Like, subscribe, share with your colleagues or friends. And what would really help is if you could also just help us out on our Patreon. We do have a Patreon page, so check that out. And obviously, we would love to hear from you. So please feel free to comment in the comments section at the end, at the bottom of the video. Thank you and goodbye.